Happy Hobbit Day! My name is Chris, aka ThePhilosophersGames, and this is my contribution for Hobbit Day 2021, where we discuss the mysterious origin of the Hobbits. As you probably have heard multiple times by now, this video is part of a collaboration of many Tolkien lore channels. The participating channels make a video each with all kinds of topics, and you will find all of them in a playlist. I link it in the description, end cards, a pinned comment, etc. You will find it for sure. Please check the other videos too. Usual disclaimer, I try to pronounce names somewhat correctly, that means trilled R's. Shoutouts to the artists that allowed me to use their fantastic artworks like Ted Nasmith, Kimberly 80 and Jenny Dolphin. And I guess, spoiler warning. If we look at the Third Age, one would expect it to at least start very well for the free peoples of Middle-earth now that Sauron lost the One Ring, but even in the early history of that age, things became bad very quick, starting with Isildur's death and the One Ring being lost just 2 years into the Third Age. Elrond comments on a similar situation for the end of the First Age and draws a parallel to the later age during the Council of Elrond. And the elves deemed that evil was ended forever, and it was not so. For long, elves, men, dwarves, and at times even Ents fought against this evil, but they could never end it. But one could say it was also often their fault, at least in parts. Feanor and his sons created many feuds among the elves due to their attacks and the kinslayings, and continued attacking their own kin even when Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, was winning. Later, the Easterling Ulfang and his men betrayed the elves in a really close battle, which became a disaster as a result. The dwarves started conflicts with the elves of Doriath too. This seems like madness when all of them have a common foe in Morgoth who will not stop until he wiped them out completely. At the end of the Second Age, it was Isildur not destroying the One Ring. But then, in the Third Age, new people come into play, the Hobbits, who should in the end accomplish what all those great lords and kings would not be able to. Of course, according to Tolkien's letters 191 and 192, a higher power was here at work, but even getting this far and this close did not happen before. As a result, the appearance of the Hobbits is a game changer. But what has this to do with the origin of the Hobbits? The problem with the origin is that we don't know anything about it, which is strange. In the recordings of history in Tolkien's world, they appear for the first time Third Age 1050, according to the Tales of Years. Here called by their Sindari name Perianath, which means halflings. Quote, Third Age 1050. About this time a shadow falls on Greenwood, and men begin to call it Mirkwood. The Perianaths are first mentioned in records with the coming of the Harfoots to Eriador. In the Nature of Middle-earth, we find a very late text of Tolkien from 1970. There we can read further. Halflings was derived from the Numenorean name for them in Sindarin Perianath. It was given first to the Harfoots, who became known to the rulers of Arnor in the 11th century of the Third Age. Later it was also applied to the Fellowhides and Sturs. This implies the name Perianath was given to the Hobbits by the Dúnedain in exile, who in general used Sindarin, so elvish names, and not by the elves, which I find very interesting. Further in this passage, it is also explained that they called them halflings because of the contrast in size between hobbits and Dúnedain, which were usually very tall. What is so unusual about this is that the elves did not name them. This is of course not a proof, but it could indicate that the elves did not know about the existence of hobbits, which is strange because some elven clans loved the woods and lived in them too. In theory, they could have met early in history, but it did not happen. In the prologue of The Lord of the Rings, we also find a confirmation for this. Quote, The beginning of Hobbits lies far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. Only the elves still preserve any records of that vanished time, and their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own history, in which men appear seldom and hobbits are not mentioned at all. So according to this source, the Hobbits did exist since the Elder Days, which is a different term for the First Age, and according to letter 131, they are closely related to men. Quote, "The Hobbits are, of course, really meant to be a branch of the specifically human race, not elves or dwarves." We find this also in the prologue of The Lord of the Rings. It is plain indeed that in spite of later estrangement, hobbits are relatives of ours. After sun and moon were created and first rose during the First Age, men also first appeared, awakening in Hildorien, which is somewhere in the far east of Middle-earth. As a result, this seems to fit. But as said, hobbits are nowhere mentioned before the Third Age, so around 5,000 years later. There are some theories one can construct. Maybe they were not part of the first tribes of men, called Edain, that fled from Hildorien. In my video about harlots and the Haladin, I explain the march of the Edain in a bit more detail if you're interested. This theory could explain why the Edain did not know about them initially, but still, it's a long time. The quote from Appendix B is from the year 1050 of the Third Age. It seems strange that they were around since the First Age of the Years of the Sun and were only noticed 4,500 to 5,000 years later. And sadly, here lies a big mystery. We know some Edain settled down on their journey to the west and became all kinds of folks. For example, the Norsemen around Rovanion. Another source we could consider too is the name that the ancestors of the people of Rohan, who are Norsemen, had for them in old legends, Holbutlan, which is Old English. It means hole builders, and is the root of the word hobbit, though Tolkien came up with the etymology after he invented the word, though some argue it existed before Tolkien wrote it down. Complicated story. The language of the Rohirrim and also some of their ancestors is represented by Old English in the books, so Tolkien had not to invent yet another language, I guess. In the actual language of the people of Rohan, they were called Kut-Dukan, only few words Tolkien wrote down. However, these ancestors of the Rohirrim also became known in the early Third Age. We of course know that hobbits can hide very well, but hiding from men and elves that live in the same region for such a long time is unusual, and if they met, they probably should have known them. Also, if we go back to the very early history of these Norsemen, we find Gothic names, also still during the Third Age though. It's hard to say how much Old English, Gothic and also, for example, Old Norse, later in the region around Dale, existed as languages in that northern region in parallel, but Gothic seemed to have vanished at some point, and Holbutlan is still Old English, which indicates early Third Age. Now, interestingly, the traditional names of the hobbits from the Shire are also Old English. Not only that, they are also just represented by Old English. For example, Frodo's actual name is Maura. It is related to the language of the ancestors of the Rohirrim. All this implies the hobbits must have had contact with those ancestors of the people of Rohan and lived close to them, adopting words and maybe the language. If they are directly related to the Norsemen is hard to say though. In the book Peoples of Middle-earth, in the chapter of Dwarves and Men, we find hints that seem to confirm that the hobbits adopted the language of the Norsemen and that there exists no trace of the original Hobbit language, though it must be said that it can be debated how canon this text is. It also mentions that Sauron appearing as necromancer in Greenwood, infesting it so that it became known as Mirkwood, drove them out of this region. This also aligns perfectly with what we just read from Appendix B. Third Age 1050. About this time, a shadow falls on Greenwood and men begin to call it Mirkwood. The Perianas are first mentioned in records with the coming of the Harfoots to Eriador. This is also quite ironic. The hobbits who will play a big part in Sauron's defeat were driven out by Sauron once, which led them to move into and around the Shire later. Sauron's presence in this region set things into motion that would lead to his fall, and later the war against Angmar drove some Stur hobbits back to the Gladden Fields close to the river Anduin, and this is how Dearol finds the One Ring later. Still, this only leaves us chronologically in the early Third Age, so not even close to the Elder Days. A passage from Of Dwarfs and Men also mentions the hobbits in context of early men and their dealings with dwarfs, but only in the sense that their dealings with each other became a later characteristic for them, and we know that dwarfs were also doing business in the Shire later, but that is all I could find in the texts. As a result, we are now left with some speculation. There are, in my opinion, not many possibilities. The hobbits could be related to those early Edain who would become the Norsemen, which I think is unlikely, or they followed the Edain later into the west, which I think is more plausible. For example, we know from the Silmarillion that during the First Age, more men came to Beleriand, a region that was the west coast of Middle-earth, so to say. These men were called Easterlings. Some were friendly allies, some became foes. They were described as, quote, "These men were short and broad, long and strong in the arm, their skins were swart or sallow, and their hair was dark as were their eyes." So looking a bit different compared to the Edain, who also came from the east at one point. Among the Edain were also the Druidain, who also looked very different from the other Edain. So I think it's plausible that from the far east, where men awoke, all kinds of men could have come to the west, including the three branches of the Hobbits, the Sturs, the Fallowhides, and the Harfoots. Later in the Third Age, in and around the Shire, they all mingled already. Of course, the early Hobbits could have also started their journey to the west even before the Edain too. As said, this is pure speculation by my side. I assume they came later and maybe settled down in the deep forests of Rhovanion, hiding quite well. Maybe some elves of that region, the Nandor, knew about them but never wrote something down. Then at some point they made contact with the Norsemen, maybe lived together for protection, adopting their language. When Sauron returned during the Third Age, hiding in Greenwood, some hobbits left the woods again, and while for the Norsemen they became legends of old, west of the Misty Mountains, the Dunedain of Arnor learned about their existence, giving them their name. The Edain of the First Age fled from the shadow that fell over the far east, that is, the first Dark Lord and Sauron's master Morgoth, who tried to corrupt men with his evil. In case the hobbits traveled later into the west, they maybe had to hide longer during their time in the far east, and maybe had to endure the evil of Morgoth longer, which could explain why some of them seem more resilient against the evil corruption of, for example, Sauron. Then they maybe lived long in hiding, for example in forests in holes, which gave them their names, customs to build hobbit holes, and maybe their connection to nature. Maybe they lived with the Norsemen even during the Second Age and lived through the changes of the language of the Norsemen too. But as said, that's just my speculation. In the events around the One Ring, the hobbits play a huge part. Bilbo even manages, with the help of Gandalf, to let the One Ring go, which is a more than impressive deed. Tolkien also comments on Frodo destroying the One Ring in the mentioned letter 192. Frodo deserved all honor because he spent every drop of his power of will and body, and that was just sufficient to bring him to the destined point and no further. Few others, possibly no others of his time, would have got so far. The other power then took over, the writer of the story, by which I do not mean myself, that one ever-present person who is never absent and never named, as one critic has said. This power is Eru, the One, which is God. For example, Gandalf is a Maya, you could say an angel of lower rank in the service of the angels of high rank, the Valar and God. The wizard even is brought back by Eru and becomes Gandalf the White. So Gandalf might know what is going on, and he makes an interesting comment on this in The Lord of the Rings in the chapter The Shadow of the Past. Behind that finding the One Ring, there was something else at work beyond any design of the ringmaker. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring and not by its maker, in which case you also were meant to have it, and that may be an encouraging thought. Eru is here at work and seems to be with the hobbits in some way. Hobbits also are a strong contrast to the wise and powerful in Middle-earth. No big heroes of elves, dwarves or men destroy the One Ring, or at least bring it close to the cracks of doom. We learned how Isildur could not do it, but in the end, the small hobbits manage to accomplish it, though they can't make the last step themselves. In a way, what the hobbits do is out of this world, and also the Shire itself seems like an anachronism. In this maybe lies a reason why Tolkien never explained the exact origin of the hobbits, because they are out of this world with a very special purpose in the world, but also for the reader. We as readers, especially in our younger days, might have identified more with the hobbits than with, for example, the lords of the Dúnedain or the elves. It is also a beautiful, encouraging message that reflects an interesting aspect of Tolkien's philosophy. Interestingly, Tolkien himself also identified with the hobbits. He writes in letter 213, "I am in fact a hobbit in all but size. I like gardens, trees and unmechanized farmlands. I smoke a pipe and like good plain food unrefrigerated, but detest French cooking. I like and even dare to wear in these dull days ornamental waistcoats. I am fond of mushrooms out of a field, have a very simple sense of humor, which even my appreciative critics find tiresome. I go to bed late and get up late when possible. I do not travel much." But Tolkien accomplished much, overcame great perils in his life and inspired generations. Happy Hobbit Day, and thank you for watching. If you liked this video, consider pressing the like button, leave a comment or even subscribe if you don't want to miss more Tolkien related content on this channel. You probably heard this a million times by now. I'm currently working on a deep dive into Elrond's lore and history, which will come out in multiple parts. Part 1 is 2 hours long and already out, but enough about me. There are other great videos in this playlist, please check them out and I wish you a lot of fun with those. Again, thank you for watching and goodbye.